Hi, everybody. Welcome back. In today's session, we're going to read Act 3, Scenes 3, 4, and I believe 5. At the end of Act 3, Scene 2, we're starting to see some really disturbing changes in Macbeth. The man who was once a fearless warrior and a loyal thane has turned into a real bad guy. He seems to be tormented by guilt and paranoia. And we noted in our time together how much easier it is to kill. He had to be goaded into killing King Duncan. And then in a panic, he killed the chamberlains, probably for fear that they would say something that might incriminate him. And in the scene that we witnessed during the last session, Macbeth has convinced himself that his former good friend and confidant Banquo is out to get him. He reasons that Banquo is out to get him because Banquo was there with Macbeth when Macbeth encountered the witches. And so he knows two things. He knows that Banquo knows he had a motive, and he also is smarting from the memory that it is Banquo's sons who will become king, not Macbeth's. Because of that, he has arranged to have these murderers, who are really peasants. He has convinced them that it is Banquo's fault that they are poor, impoverished, and miserable, and has arranged to have them ambush Banquo and his son Fleance when they are on their way back from a riding excursion, coming back into the castle for the feast. So, scene 3. We open the scene on actually not 2, but 3 murderers. So there's one more than there were in the previous scene. And so the first murderer is saying, "But who did bid thee join with us?" They're asking the third guy, "Why are you here? Who told you to join us?" The third man says, "Macbeth." And the second one said, "He needs not our mistrust, since he delivers our offices and what we have to do to the direction just." This is classic Macbeth at this point. He hires 2 people to do a job, and then he hires 1 person to check on the 2 people that are doing the job. He's so paranoid. He can't stop looking over his shoulder. So he has clearly commissioned this third guy to kind of check up on the first 2. The first murderer says, "Well, then stand with us. The west yet glimmers with some streaks of day. Now spurs the lated traveler apace to gain the timely inn, and near approaches the subject of our watch." At this point, you can hear some horses, and the third murderer says, "Hark, I hear horses." And before you see Banquo, you hear his voice saying, "Give us a light there, ho." The second murderer says, "Then 'tis he. The rest that are within the note of expectation already are in the court," meaning every other guest has already arrived. It must be him. The first one says his horses go about almost a mile. What he means by their horses go about, he means the horses are either being walked in or being led in slowly. And the third man says, "Almost a mile, but he does usually, so all men do, from hence to the palace gate make it their walk." At this point, Banquo and his son Fleance, carrying a torch, walk onto the stage. We can assume that the murderers are trying to conceal themselves behind a bush or something, because the second one says, a light, 'tis he, stand to it." Banquo and Fleance don't see them, so Banquo just says, "It will be rain tonight. Looks like it's going to rain tonight." And the first murderer says, "Let it come down!" And all 3 murderers attack. But they're not really very smart murderers, because they all jump on Banquo, and they forget about Fleance. So as Banquo is being stabbed, he cries out, "Oh, treachery! Fly, good Fleance, fly, fly, fly! Thou mayest revenge! Oh, slave!" And he dies. And Fleance, little coward, runs away. Doesn't even try to help his dad. He just runs away. But after it's all done, the lights, we can assume that the lights went out. Because when the lights come back on, the third murderer says, "Who did strike out the light?" So somebody must have, put out the torch they were carrying. The first one says, "Well, was it not the way? Wasn't that what we were supposed to do?" And the third guy says, "There is but one down. The sun is fled." Second murderer says, "We have lost the best half of our affair." Well, let's away and see how much is done. So they have killed Banquo savagely, but Banquo's son, Fleance, got away. So there's still somebody else to be afraid of. In the next scene, scene 4, we open up to a banquet. All of the heavy dishes, everything looks fancy. Macbeth enters onto the scene with Lady Macbeth, Ross Lennox, and a bunch of attendants. And Macbeth greets all of the thanes of the nobles, and he says, "You all know your degrees. Sit down. At first and last, the hearty welcome." Now, when he says, "You know your degrees, sit down," there used to be a system where you would sit, you'd have a certain place where you would sit. Probably the men that were the most powerful would sit closest to the king and they would move outward. You may recall reading about King Arthur's round table. He had decided he was not going to have a table that had degrees in it because one man would be considered superior to another. He was going to make a round table so everybody would be equal. But we can assume that hasn't happened in Scottish history at this point. All of the lords thank him, "Thanks to your majesty," and Macbeth says, "Ourself will mingle with society and play the humble host. Our hostess keeps her state, but in best time we will require her welcome." Lady Macbeth says, "Pronounce it for me, sir, to all our friends, for my heart speaks they are welcome." At this point, a murderer appears at the door, and he's kind of like, "Psst, Macbeth, come here." Macbeth doesn't see him at first, and he says, "See, they encounter thee with their heart's thanks. Both sides are even. Here, I'll sit in the midst, be large in mirth. Anon we'll drink a measure. The table's round." And he walks over to the murderer and says, "There's blood upon thy face." And the murderer says, "'Tis Banquo's then." Macbeth responds, "'Tis better thee without than he within. Is he dispatched?" Meaning, is he killed? The murderer says, "My lord, his throat is cut. That I did for him." Macbeth says, "Thou art the best of the cutthroats, yet he's good that did the like for Fleance. If thou didst it, thou art the non-peril." The murderer says, "Most royal sir, Fleance has escaped." And in an aside, so to himself, Macbeth says, "Then comes my fit again. I had else been perfect, whole as the marble, founded as the rock, as broad and general as the casing air, but now I'm cabined, cribbed, confined, bound to saucy doubts and fears. But Banquo's safe." So to himself he said, "Again, I would have been perfect if Banquo had died. That would have been great. Everything would have been fine. But now I am still confined to my doubts and fears." He confirms Banquo's safe. By that he means Banquo's dead. And the murderer says, "Aye, my good lord, safe in a ditch he bides with 20 trenched gashes on his head, the least a death to nature." Macbeth says, "Thanks for that. There the grown serpent lies. The worm that's fled hath nature that in time will venom breed. No teeth for present. Get thee gone. Tomorrow we'll hear ourselves again." And Lady Macbeth says, "My royal lord, you do not give the cheer. The feast is sold that is not often vouched while 'tis a making. 'Tis given with welcome. To feed we're best at home. From thence the sauce to meat to ceremony, meeting we're bare without it." So she calls to her husband, "Come on over and join the party." Macbeth kind of shoos the murderer away, and he turns around. Here's where things get good. This is a very famous scene in literature. The ghost of Banquo appears. Remember how I told you that King James was kind of fascinated with the supernatural, ghosts and witches and things like that? Well, the actor who plays the part of Banquo comes onto stage all ghosty-like, all white, covered in blood, looking really gross. And at first, Macbeth doesn't see him. But the ghost goes and he sits right in Macbeth's chair at the table, which frankly is hilarious. Macbeth is saying to his wife, "Sweet remembrancer, now good digestion wait on appetite and health on both." And Lennox says, "May it please your highness, sit." Still, Macbeth doesn't seem to notice yet. His back is turned, and he says, "Here had we now our country's honor roofed, were the graced person of our Banquo present, who may I rather challenge for unkindness than pity for mischance." In a supreme moment of irony, Macbeth says, "I just wish Banquo were here. I wonder where he is." And Ross says, "His absence, sir, lays blame upon his promise. Please it your highness, grace us with your royal company." And we can assume at this point Macbeth turns and freezes. And there's a great moment of drama where he just is frozen and he says, "The table's full." Lennox says, "Well, here is a place reserved, sir." Macbeth says, "Where?" Lennox said, "Here, my good lord. What is it that moves your highness?" Now, from the way Lennox and the other Thanes are reacting, we can assume that they cannot see the ghost. The audience can, of course, and Macbeth can, but no one else sees him, which may be just another indication of Macbeth's instability. All of a sudden, Macbeth gets angry. He says, "Which of you have done this?" And they all are, "What, my good lord?" And all of a sudden, he's shaking his finger at the ghost who's sitting at his chair, and he says, "Thou canst not say I did it. Never shake thy gory locks at me." And all of a sudden, people are reacting, and Ross says, "Gentlemen, rise. His Highness is not well." And ever the person on damage control, Lady Macbeth says, "Oh, sit, worthy friends. My lord is often thus, and hath been from his youth. Pray you, keep seat. The fit is momentary. Upon a thought, he will again be well. If you much note him, you shall offend him and extend his passion. Feed it and regard him not." So she seems to say, "Oh, nothing to worry about, everybody. This just happens to my husband every now and again. It's just a little fit. It'll go away soon. Just pretend you don't notice." And then she draws her husband aside and says, "Are you a man?" He says, "Aye, and a bold one that dare look upon that which might appall the devil." She says, "Proper stuff. This is the very painting of your fear. This is the air-drawn dagger, which you said led you to Duncan. Oh, these flaws and starts, impostors to true fear, would well become a woman's story at a winter's fire authorized by her grandam. Shame itself. Why do you make such faces? When all is done, you look but on a stool." So she can't see it either, and she chastises or scolds him by saying, "This is just like that dagger you told me about. It's not really there." Macbeth is convinced, though. He says, "Prithee, see there. Behold, look," to the ghost. He shakes his head and he says, "Lo, how say you? Why, what care I? If thou canst nod, speak too. If charnel houses and our graves must send those we bury back, our monuments shall be the maws of kites." And at this point, the ghost exits. He either disappears or goes away. He's gone. And Macbeth kind of looks, and Lady Macbeth says, "Quite unmanned in folly." And Macbeth says, "If I stand here, I saw him." She says, "Fie, for shame." And Macbeth says this out loud. This is not in an aside, so the other characters hear him. He says, "Blood hath been shed ere now in the olden time, ere human statute purged the giant wheel. Aye, and since too, murders have been performed too terrible for the ear. The time had been that when the brains were out, the man would die, and there an end. But now they rise again with 20 mortal murders on their crowns and push us from our stools. This is more strange than such a murderess." So it's interesting. He's talking to himself, but the other people can hear him. And he's like, "Oh, blood has been shed. There was a time when you could kill a man and he'd stay dead. And now they rise up and push you right out of your chair. This is really weird." Lady Macbeth tries to make him more attentive, and she says, "My worthy lord, your noble friends do lack you." She seems to be trying to tell him, "Careful what you say. People are listening." And he gets himself together and he says, "I do forget. Do not muse at me, my most worthy friends. I have a strange infirmity, which is nothing to those who know me. Come, love and health to all. Then I'll sit down. Give me some wine. Fill full." And as they're filling the glasses, the ghost returns. And once again, Macbeth says this ironic line, "I drink to the general joy of the whole table and to our dear friend Banquo, whom we miss. Would he were here. To all in him we thirst, and all to all." So he makes this toast to Banquo, and here's the ghost again. Now, probably what happens is, after he makes this toast, all the lords say, "Our duty's in the pledge." And then Macbeth turns and sees the ghost is back, and he probably throws his cup or does something extreme, because he says, "Avaunt and quit my sight. Let the earth hide thee. Thy bones are marrowless, thy blood is cold. Thou hast no speculation in those eyes that thou dost glare with." Lady Macbeth says, "Think of this, good peers, but as a thing of custom. 'Tis no other, only it spoils the pleasure of the time." Once again, she's trying to downplay it. But Macbeth remains talking to the empty chair. He says, "Well, what man dare? I dare. Approach thou like a rugged Russian bear, the armed rhinoceros, or the Hystron tiger. Take any shape but that, and my firm nerve shall never tremble, or be alive again. And dare me to the desert with thy sword. If trembling I inhabit then, protest me the baby of a girl. Hence, horrible shadow, unreal mockery. Hence. And the ghost disappears. And he says, why, so being gone, I'm a man again. Oh, pray you, sit still, he says. Lady Macbeth says, you have displaced the mirth and broke the good meeting with most admired disorder. So she kind of says, you really screwed it up this time, honey. He says, can such things be and overcome us like a summer's cloud without our special wonder? You make me strange, even to the disposition that I owe, when now I think that you can behold such sights and keep the natural ruby of your cheeks, when mine is blanched with fear. Ross says, what sights, my lord? What are you talking about? And Lady Macbeth knows we're too far gone to save it, so she says, I pray you, speak not. He grows worse and worse. Questions enrage him. At once, good night. Stand not upon the order of your going, but go at once. And they all kind of stand up, and they're all just shocked at what they've seen and heard. Lennox says, good night, and better health attend his majesty. Lady Macbeth says, a kind good night to all. And they file out till it's just the two of them. And when everybody's gone, Macbeth says, they will have blood, they say. Blood will have blood. Stones have been known to move, and trees to speak, and augurs and understood relations have by magpies and chalks and roots brought forth the secretest man of blood. And he seems to say, when he says blood will have blood, he kind of means what goes around comes around. It's, if you kill somebody, their blood will come back to you. And then he also alludes to that idea of murder will out when he said murder has a way of making itself known. He must know and be aware of the fact that he said some pretty incriminating things during that scene, and all of the Thanes heard him. Everybody important in the kingdom heard that little display of his. He then says, what is the night? She says, almost at odds with morning, which is which? And then all of a sudden Macbeth thinks of something, and he says, how sayest thou that Macduff denies his great person at our bidding? All of a sudden he notices, hey, you know what? Macduff wasn't here. And he invited him. So now this is twice that Macduff has dissed him. Lady Macbeth says, did you send to him? Did you invite him? He says, I hear it by the way, but I will send. There is not a one of them, but in his house I keep a servant feed. Notice how that word is spelled F-E-E', like you pay a fee. He reveals there that he has servants in Macduff's house that he's paying. He has spies planted everywhere. This is how paranoid he has become. He has made another decision too, because he says, I will tomorrow, and betimes I will to the weird sisters. More shall they speak. For now, I am bent to know by the worst means the worst. For mine own good, all causes shall give way. I am in blood steps so far that should I wade no more, returning where as tedious as to go o'er. Strange things that I have in head that will to hand, which must be acted or they may be scanned. So some important things he said in that part. He said he has decided he's going to return to the witches because he wants to hear what's going to happen. No matter what it is, he's got to know. Then he also says, I am steeped in blood so far that returning were as tedious as to go o'er. By that he means I'm in so deep now. I just have to keep going. I have to keep killing. There's no point in turning back. He's talking so crazy that his wife says to him, you lack the season of all natures, sleep. You need to sleep. And he says, come, will to sleep. My strange and self-abuse is the initiate fear that wants hard use. We are yet but young, indeed. And by indeed, he means we are yet but young in action. There's more. That implies there's more killing to be done. There's more that we're going to do. Now, the next scene, Act 3, Scene 5, we're not going to read. It was put in the play largely for special effects. And it went back to the three witches who were hanging out with the main witch, Hecate. And Hecate was kind of bummed that they were having fun with Macbeth and she was left out. So we see them, and they seem to know that Macbeth is coming, and so they hustle away. In Scene 6, though, which is the final scene of the act, we're going to read this one. We're back with Lennox, who was present at that dinner party where Macbeth lost it. He's talking to another lord, and this is what the Thanes are saying now. Their opinion of their king has really changed. Lennox says, we kind of come in mid-conversation, and Lennox says, "My former speeches have but hit your thoughts, which can interpret farther. Only, I say, things have been strangely born. The gracious Duncan was pitied of Macbeth. Marry, he was dead. And the right valiant Banquo walked too late, whom you may say, if it please you, Fleance killed, for Fleance fled. Men must not walk too late. Who cannot want the thought how monstrous it was for Malcolm and Donalbain to kill their gracious father? Damned fact. Oh, how it did grieve Macbeth. Did he not straight in pious rage the two delinquents tear that were the slaves of drink and thralls of sleep? Was that not nobly done? Aye, and wisely too, for 'twould have angered any heart alive to hear the men deny it. So that I say, he's borne all things well. And I do think that had he Duncan's sons under his key, and as it please heaven he shall not, they should find what were to kill a father, and so should Fleance. So from that, we can see that the Thanes have been talking about all that has happened, and they suspect that Macbeth was the man who killed Duncan, and they also suspect that, if he had Malcolm and Donalbain around, he'd kill them too. Lennox continues and says, "But peace. For from broad words and cause he failed his presence at the tyrant's feast. I hear Macduff lives in disgrace. Sir, can you tell me where he bestows himself?" So Lennox says, "I hear Macduff's in big trouble because he didn't come to that banquet. Do you know where he is?" The Lord says, "The son of Duncan," meaning Malcolm, "from whom this tyrant holds the due of birth, lives in the English court, and is received of the most pious Edward with such grace that the malevolence of fortune nothing takes from his high respect." So basically he says, Malcolm has taken refuge with the King of England, who is a super awesome guy. Now, we can never forget that Shakespeare is writing to please the king, so he puts a little flattery going on. We're not talking about King James, it's just that kings of England in general are just super awesome people. So he says, this king has taken Malcolm in and just treated him wonderfully. Thither, which means there, thither Macduff is gone to pray the holy king upon his aid to wake Northumberland and warlike seaward, that by the help of these, and him above to ratify the work, we may again give to our tables meat, sleep to our nights, free from our feasts and banquets, bloody knives, do faithful homage, and receive free honors, all which we pine for now. And this report has so exasperate the king that he prepares for some attempt at war. So this lord has told us that Malcolm has taken refuge with the King of England, and Macduff has gone there to try to convince Malcolm to come back and take over the throne, maybe hopefully with the help of an English army. Lennox said, "Sent he to Macduff?" Lord says, "He did, sir. With an absolute 'Sir, not I,' the cloudy messenger turns me his back and hums as one who should say, 'You'll rue the time that clogs me with this answer.'" And Lennox says, "And that well might advise him to a caution, to hold what distance his wisdom can provide." He's talking here about Macduff. He should stay away. "Some holy angel fly to the court of England and unfold his message ere he come, that a swift blessing may soon return to this our suffering country under a hand accursed." And the Lord says, "I'll send my prayers with him." So it ends on a note of the Thanes praying that some holy angel will save them from the clutches of this man-turned-tyrant called Macbeth. So that concludes the reading of Act 3. But remember, there's some more good stuff coming up in Act 4, because Macbeth is going back to those witches. To be continued. Thanks for joining me. Bye.